we want to take a step back and start looking at what the current trends were for 2023 and recently in the month of Jan 2024. So fairly straightforward, right? All
Everybody
I did
loves
was
a trend
cybersecurity.
slide. I just want to say,
cybersecurity.
before you go down this thing, when you do a trend slide, it's like one of those things of what really happened last year. It's like we're all there, but we want to hear the worst of it. So what was the worst that happened? And then tell us what's going to happen this year, Al.
It's funny, we actually did a webinar for the M365 UG, and we went through trends, and people tend to do this in January, right? But when we look at the breaches that we've seen over 2023, I'm going to highlight a few, and we're going to end on the one that we most want to talk about in 2024. Simple one. Look at that, VMware, right? The stack of all stacks that have now been bought over by Broadcom, they were hit. They were hit actually in November, and it's recent. And there's no order to this. I didn't go from January to December, but this is a big thing, right? VMware was targeted. Go anywhere, another data breach, right? And we'll talk about data breaches and why data exposure is important, or at least you need to understand what that looks like. 3CX breach as well, through linked to supply chain attacks. And, your attack vectors are different based on the type of actor that's trying to get in. And we're not delving into that. That's for another webinar. Move it, cyber attacks, also around data theft, because we'll talk about why it's important to understand what that looks like. This came through a zero-day exploit. So, hopefully you'll get that CVE to fix that problem, right? I don't know what was done here, but I just wanted to highlight a few of the things that happened over the last 14 months. And Nick, if you could give me some drum roll, the big one that we want to talk about that, launched cybersecurity attacks at the beginning of this year was this one, Midnight Blizzard, right? Someone got into the Microsoft environment. You want to take us through the anatomy of what this looks like, Nick?
It was a little bit embarrassing, and I say embarrassing, obviously, in many senses. It was unfortunate that it happened for Microsoft. It's embarrassing the way that it happened. So if we look at the anatomy of the attack and what Microsoft published and what they didn't publish, it was a relatively straightforward attack. Somebody knew there was something to password spray. And we don't expect anyone to be password sprayed these days and actually get in, because it's a pretty legacy thing, right? Yeah. So are passwords actually still relevant? Turns out they password sprayed. They managed to get an account. Exploring that account, they then managed to find an application. And that application had rights to do stuff. So they talk about in the article a legacy test OAuth application, which basically, if we legacy test, that sounds like an old application that nobody had maintained, right? And then what happened? They used that application to create a user account that had permissions specifically to an API called Exchange Web Services. And Exchange Web Services as an API just falls off the radar, right? Because they weren't a member of a group. They just happened to grant a very specific API permission, which is read, write to mailboxes. Then using that permission, they opened any mailbox they wanted at leisure, because if we think about it, how did we used to export mail and migrate mail from one Exchange tenant to the other? Using the identical API. So if this thing pops up in a log, it's, well, we don't care. So why this is doubly embarrassing is because AWS is a depreciated protocol, right? So if you think about the stuff that was left on, and lots of legacy here, Al, there were passwords that were simplistic enough to be password sprayed. There were apps that weren't maintained. There were protocols enabled that should have been dead and not enabled on any mailboxes. And then there were sufficient permissions in the application that was taken over to create a user account with the rights needed to exfiltrate mail. Embarrassing.
It's a massive thing, right? Well, in Microsoft's defense, you have to support these legacy things because there's still 300, 400, 500 people still using EWS. We had a conversation with a customer, I think it was last week, Nick, where we talked about EWS and public folders, right? So
Yes.
it's still out there in the wild, and they happen to find this vulnerability, and they use the exploit. Simple as that, right? So, segueing into what does this mean to organizations outside of Exchange? Because Nick's the Exchange guy, so we have to, bring him back on track. When we look at typical exploits that happen, and don't lose your pants around it. And what we wanted to do is talk around 2 specific areas, or maybe 3 specific areas that you need to be aware of. And if you're not aware of this, please go have a look. There's a lot of information about these things online. So the first batch, Nick, do you want to go through this?
Oh, this is like how we used to do things, right? So if we look at the first few on the top, code injection, SQL injection, if you were insecure enough that a code injection attack worked, or if SQL allowed a statement to be changed, then we could inject code or SQL into a server or a database and then make that database do whatever we wanted to. Again, we don't expect these type of attacks, so a server-side template injection, HTTP header injection, talks about actually losing physical control of the web server or just those web pages. So good old-fashioned, very much like good old-fashioned LDAP on the bottom, where we've got permissions on the file system that are too insecure. We can easily cruise those if they are internet exposed. If it's in any way insecure, someone on the internet will find it. And those are super easy, low-hanging fruit from an injection point of view.
Yeah, and typically, if you look at it, the stack that you have to worry about from an application perspective inside of any organization that's older than 20 years, these things should still exist because the application works. We're not going to change it. We speak to customers all the time and say, hey, have you got cloud native architecture for these applications? They go, well, why? It's a VM. We've got 3 virtual machines running. Let's just move that to Azure. And in so doing, you still have these problems. I mean, when you start looking at the other one to look at is traditional broken authentication, right? For those that follow Linus Tips, LTT, he had a session hijack, a cookie hijack a few months ago where they literally compromised an account again, identity, grabbed the cookie, the session state, and actually used that to do things inside of his YouTube channel. And they were changing passwords and all of those things. It didn't matter because they had the session state. So it's important to understand how identity actually works. And when we talked about brute force, credential stuffing, Troy Hunt made his name in being able to provide, have I been pawned with, and these hackers will use that as a dictionary, a password dictionary, to go and sift through that when it comes to the traditional brute force attacks that we would normally see. Cross-site scripting, yeah, and when you start looking at how you can publish applications inside of your tenant, it's quite scary, right? And then obviously token cracking and some fixation attacks. Again, all talking to what you can do from a session perspective, ID specifically. And again, ID, identity. And typically what that leads to, right, these loopholes, risks and mistakes. And we talk to customers about this all the time. The more data you hoard, the more attack surface the customer has, right? And not the customer, the nefarious character. They get in and they take your data because that's what we see, right? Ashley Madison, everyone was, half of the people on there, ended up with divorces because they exposed details and data, right? So understand what your surface is when you start looking at these things. Security misconfigurations, Nick, you've seen this.
So I was thinking of an ad that I saw this morning, Al, which was actually an ad for maintaining a system for the German railway that was based on Windows 3.11, not Windows 3.11 for workgroups. And if we talk about security misconfiguration, how do you secure something that is 30 years old and is in some way connected to the internet? We have this thing that's called the long tail of previous best practices. And security misconfigurations apply very often when we secure something with yesterday's knowledge. So I have this thing, and we've seen this all the time, where someone creates something in the cloud, but they secure it like they're securing a data center, not realizing that the attack surface is actually massive.
That's a big thing, you know, and that then gets interpreted incorrectly, like you mentioned with the EWS stuff, right, around logging and monitoring. So how do you actively, without deploying some sort of SIEM or some sort of, you know, XDR, EDR, MDR solution where you're actually monitoring and looking at these reports and making data-driven decisions based on what you see coming through on a screen, right? And there's so much information that a lot of the times they just slip through the cracks and end up the person has actually been in for a couple of months, right? But, you know, those are the traditional things to look for, right? Understand what they are.